What's up, everybody? Ryan Thomas live on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Today is Wednesday, October 2nd, and great things in store for the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Got a lot of great guests coming up to talk about a lot of different topics. But before I have those guests on the podcast, I wanted to dive into a real massive fight in the MMA landscape in the world of mixed martial arts, and that is Robert the Reaper Whittaker versus Israel the Last Style Bender Adesanya. Two very talented fighters, but with two very awesome nicknames, the Reaper and the Last Style Bender. Where did they come up with these nicknames? I don't know, but I like those nicknames a lot. Those nicknames are pretty damn cool. So Robert Whittaker, the UFC middleweight champ. It's been a little bit of a rough road for Robert Whittaker. This is his first fight in what feels like an eternity due to the fact that Robert Whittaker has had a plethora of injuries. A hernia, pulled him out of his last fight with Kelvin Gastelum, which led Israel Adesanya versus Anderson Silva to be promoted from the co-main event of that card to the main event of that card. Israel Adesanya winning that fight versus Anderson Silva, who is also obviously one of the biggest names in the sport's history, one of the greatest champions, maybe the greatest champion that the sport has ever seen. And Israel Adesanya parlayed that into a fight with Kelvin Gastelum, co-main event at UFC something, where Max Holloway versus Dustin Poirier went down, Israel Adesanya versus Kelvin Gastelum went down. Both of those fights for the interim titles in their respective weight classes, lightweight and middleweight. Adesanya getting that decision over Kelvin Gastelum, and man, was that a barn burner of a fight. Both guys went toe-to-toe. I believe maybe Adesanya got the finish in that one late. I could be wrong, but so many fights to remember. It's tough to keep track. But nonetheless, that has led us to this moment of Israel Adesanya finally getting that true title shot versus the champion, Robert Whittaker. And I guess what really I find fascinating about this UFC middleweight division is the fact that Robert Whittaker actually didn't win the title from the last middleweight champion, who was George St. Pierre. George St. Pierre beat Michael Bisping to take the title, and then he vacated the title, and Robert Whittaker was the then interim champion and was promoted as the UFC middleweight champion. So I guess really we'll find out who the true champ is once and for all in this middleweight division as these two fighters attempt to unify the titles, or really as Adesanya attempts to unify the title, and as Whittaker tries to stake his claim as the UFC middleweight champion. Whittaker did win two massive fights against Yoel Romero. Those were slobber knockers. Those were barn burners as well. Whittaker and Adesanya have been in barn burners, slobber knockers, really the last year, 2 years, 3 years now. So putting a fight between Whittaker and Adesanya together is only going to produce one thing and one thing only: more fireworks. So I'm really excited for this fight. This fight takes place Saturday night, 10 in the East, 7 in the West, from the Marvel Stadium in Australia. Should be a massive, massive event. It is the highest attended event, will be the highest attended event in MMA history. This is a big one. So good for the UFC to really promote this fight as they should have, because you have an Australian in Robert Whittaker, born a New Zealander, and you have Israel Adesanya, a New Zealander, born in Africa, that I think will definitely be a barn burner of a fight. How these guys match up stylistically: Robert Whittaker is a fighter that I've looked at extensively the last few years, not just in his title fights, but how did Robert Whittaker get to this point? How did he get so good? He wasn't always this good. I remember there was a Robert Whittaker a few years ago that fought Stephen Wonderboy Thompson and lost that fight. So how did Robert Whittaker get this good? How did he get from being a challenger to a contender to a champion? Or a contender to a challenger to a champion, I should say. And I guess the best answer that I have for everybody is that he just amped up what he did really, really well and continued to work really, really hard. That is the one takeaway that I have, the biggest Thomas takeaway that I have, the first Thomas takeaway that I have from Robert Whittaker is that he works extremely hard. He's very well-rounded. He's got great punches. He's got great kicks. And more than anything, he has great timing. Not so much accuracy, but his timing, whether it's his takedown defense, his takedown offense, or his timing on his kicks and his punches and his clinches. He's just very well-rounded. And that is oftentimes the case when you look at a UFC MMA champion. They have to be well-rounded in virtually every discipline possible, whether it's wrestling, striking, boxing, Muay Thai, takedown defense, takedown offense, jiu-jitsu. Robert Whittaker doesn't really have many weaknesses. I haven't seen any weaknesses in his game in his most recent fights. I haven't seen anything that makes me say, oh, wow, that's something that somebody else could expose. I haven't seen that yet. But with a challenger like Israel Adesanya, a guy that throws a lot of wild and crazy techniques at his opponents, sometimes that opens things up for Adesanya or for any fighter that does such to land something completely out of the ordinary. So this could be a fight where something could be landed completely out of the norm and it just blows